Together. The primitive woman did not have a name as you or I would understand it. Several of her people associated her with Moss for reasons they would have been neither able nor inclined to explain, so if you like, we can call her Moss. For 3 moon cycles in the spring, she passed no blood, and slowly her belly began to swell. She had wanted a baby. She had mated with all the men in her people, one after another, moaning loudly so they would hear her and want her. It was exhausting. It was painful by the end, but she had been determined. She had had her pubic hair for many summers and winters now, and with no offspring. When her body held its blood now, she bit back her hope. She had cried the tears of shame and disappointment before, and this time had determined, whether or not it was her fate to climb that mountain, that she would accept the will of the gods peacefully. In fact, though of course Moss was the first to notice the swelling of her own belly, it was her mother who first pointed it out. And only then would Moss allow the joy and the relief to fill her chest and her face. She had a baby in her. The baby had many fathers. She laughed out loud and jumped up and down, running around the hilly parts of the savannah to which her people always came when it was summer, shouting at everyone and showing them her bump. The elders smiled for her and shared her joy, though they knew well the hardships that were ahead of her. It would be harder now, the journey she must take. She should have started out earlier. Preparations would have to be made quickly. Her baby's many fathers went out that day to hunt and to gather for her gifts of meat and hides. Moss and her mother went to gather nuts and berries. Moss believed she had a son inside her, since he had so many fathers. Her mother thought this was a silly and childish thing to believe. It would be a girl. They gathered the nuts and berries into an old dry piece of aurochs hide, and when the sun started growing heavy, they brought the 4 corners of the hide together over Moss's shoulder, and they made their way towards the people's fire. One of the fathers, the one who reminded her of an old tree, though in fact he was younger than her, brought her leather thongs of varying lengths. He showed her again how to make a pouch of rabbit skin for putting things into. His hands hypnotized her as they moved, making things out of rabbit that were not rabbit, as though it were as simple as sharpening a stick or starting a fire. The gods had showed him how to do it when he was a bump in his mother's own belly. What would the gods teach to her bump? What new magic would she bring down from the mountain growing inside of her? Young Old Tree handed the rabbit skin pouch to Moss and smiled warmly at the mystified reverence with which she took it. She decided she would put pretty rocks in it for him and show him when she got back. No. If she's the mother of his baby, he would rather see she can be an adult and not use such a gift for something so frivolous. She would fill it with berries and eggs. She couldn't act like a child anymore. She was a mother now. She must be serious. Of course, if she happened to come across any pretty rocks, she could put them in her pouch, but she couldn't go looking for them. She laid herself down to sleep that night, but her body was restless. She sat by the fire, sharpening a large stick and thinking about her baby. Somehow she knew this would be her only one, but for some reason this did not make her sad. Some women have many babies with only a few fathers. She had one baby with many fathers, and he would be the best baby. He would be fat and healthy and smart and quiet and clean. She would keep him clean, and she would teach him everything she knows. The gods would teach him such wonderful things that even young Old Tree would be amazed at the things her baby could do. The sun came up and she was hardening the pointed tip of her spear in the fire. She piled all the foods and meats she could carry onto the aurochs skin she slept on, and folding the corners together, hoisted it over her shoulder. And with her spear in her other hand, she kissed her mother goodbye, and she left her people to go alone across the savannah towards the holy mountain. Alone. Now there was a great lake that provided for them, with wise old trees for their fires, and acorns and fat little squirrels for their food, when fall and winter made everything everywhere else barren and foodless. The water which fed that lake was sent by the gods in a river from the holy mountain. When a woman got pregnant, it was her task to find the river and follow it up holy mountain, and ask the gods to bless her baby with some new teaching. She pushed her body forward. The air was thick and heavy and still. The grass was stiff and thirsty. Only she and the insects were moving. Pregnant clouds crept over the horizon. Soon they would smother the sun and pour water on everything. She would have no fire tonight. She thought about stopping and making a fire in the grass, just to cook a piece of her meat, but she didn't want to stop in the sight of her people. She would just have to eat her meat raw and hope it wasn't diseased. Her mother didn't like that she did that sometimes, but what was she supposed to do when it's too wet or too dry to build a fire? She fixed her eyes on a friendly old tree in the distance. If she could reach it before the clouds overtook the sun, she could hide her food and rest in the tree. Moss's mother had always hated how much she climbed trees. That was for chimps, apes. The gods chose us, the humans. The gods chose us because we walk on the ground and our hands are free to carry rocks or spears and knives and food. Did Moss climb trees because she wanted to show the gods that they were wrong to choose her? A human's eyes shouldn't be on branches. They should be on the horizon and the sky and the holy mountain. But Moss couldn't help it if she felt safer in trees, and secretly she had always doubted that the gods cared much if she looked at the sky or the trees or the horizon or looked down to the ground for pretty rocks or watched the insects fuss. Moss had always secretly doubted that anyone knew why the gods chose people. Her lungs were breathing harder than they should have, even with all her provisions. It was the bump, of course, eating up all her food from the inside like a little parasite. She snickered to herself. This was happening. This was really happening. She had dreamed of this. She would think she was dreaming now, but her dreams had never been so sweaty, so panting. That was made all this so real. The way her feet hurt. She wouldn't worry yet that this would be her first time sleeping alone. She would prove herself worthy of the gods' blessing. Every mother had to, most younger than her in their first times. She was strong. When she reached the big old friendly tree, she found a soft spot in the soil among the roots and in the shade. She sat there, rested her back on the trunk, and unfolded her provisions, taking out a hunk of deer. She filled her rabbit pouch with nuts and berries, and then covered her provisions with another hide, and weighed it down with rocks to keep most of the night critters out of it. She climbed the friendly old tree with meat in her mouth and the rabbit pouch hanging around her neck. There was no mother here to give her disapproving looks. She was going to sleep in this tree tonight and no one was going to stop her. She promised herself that if the gods told her not to climb trees anymore, she wouldn't, no matter how scary it was on the ground, and then fell asleep halfway through eating the meat. She slept through the rain and the thunder, and though several times she woke up to a half-remembered noise and stared around her wide-eyed, and one time she woke and threw up over the side of her branch, she always fell back asleep before she could think. She would always remember the moment she woke in the sunlight and discovered her half-eaten hunk of deer still clutched in her hands as one of the happiest moments of her life. When she climbed down the tree, she found that she had also not vomited on her provisions. It was a good morning. Sitting at the base of the tree, she savored the freshly washed air and the remainder of the meat that she had climbed the tree with. She uncovered her provisions, scared away the mice that had found their way in, folded it back up, and set off, with her eyes fixed on the holy mountain. She smelled a rabbit but left it alone. She had a sense of purpose today, unlike anything she had known before. But darkness came quickly, and soon she was rubbing fire into a pile of dead grass she'd gathered. Of course she'd found no wood, but only grass, and there were no trees she could reach tonight. So laying down beside her grass fire and clutching at her bundle of provisions and her spears, she kept feeding and feeding the fire, though the smell nauseated her. Because without the fire there would be darkness, and she would be sleeping alone without a fire. When the vomit came up, it came up suddenly, and put out the fire. She laid in the darkness wondering if she should get up and go somewhere, or if the smell of vomit would keep away predators. She neither slept nor moved until the stars started fading and the world went from black to gray. She got up and ate 2 figs and 2 hazelnuts, and then 2 more figs, and then a bite of elk, and then another bite of elk, and then just 1 more to chew on while she walked. She thought it must be a boy inside her. He was so hungry. When the cool blue light was just enough to see the holy mountain, still just a tiny disruption in the wide, flat horizon of the summer savanna, she started walking. The sun swelled into the sky behind her as she walked, and soon it beat down on her. By the time it was high, the water drained from her body and covered her skin, and feces locked in her bowels. Her tongue was dry and sticky. Her feet grew clumsy. She tried not to pant. She craned her neck and looked around, sniffing and listening and looking for water. She did this for a long time and found nothing. She sighed and hitched up her bundle of provisions. Leaning more and more heavily on her spear, she continued plodding towards the holy mountain. She didn't stop that night. She feared if she stopped she would not be able to start again, but after a long time in starlight her body dropped her to her hands and knees, and she let out a thin trickle of vomit, and then she could not get back up. So she laid on her back in the grass and looked up at the stars, and muttering she told the gods that she was still coming, though she didn't know whether or not they heard her. And if they did, she did not know whether or not they believed her. She did not know if she believed herself. She floated upwards, gently among the stars, and she was with them and she was one of them. But then all at once she sat up on the ground. It was hot already. She could not lift her provisions. Her head throbbed and her stomach twisted. It took her a long time, looking at the horizon, to find the holy mountain. Panic had crept all the way up her neck before she found it. She decided she would not walk at night anymore, though she knew if she didn't find water soon, she wouldn't be walking at all. She scanned the horizon again for a glint of water, and she couldn't find water, but she did find a tree. She left her provisions where they lay. She tried to eat some nuts from her rabbit pouch, and could not chew them. She tried to eat some berries, but she could not bring them near her face without gagging, so she threw them angrily aside. So leaning heavily on her spear, she plodded forward. She could hope it was a fruit tree. She would suck greedily at the juice. She wouldn't even eat them, just squeeze them into her mouth like a little kid. Fruit after fruit. She would take some fruit with her and make up for the berries that she lost. By the time the sun shone heavy from the center of the sky, she could see that this was a large and glorious tree, but it was of a kind that had only nuts, and only them just before winter. There would be no fruit for her. She would almost certainly die. She'd always believed it was better for a mother to die trying to climb the holy mountain than to have an unblessed baby. At least she would know she had tried. But she didn't even reach the mountain. Her mother would be so disappointed. So would the fathers. Would all of the fathers? Would old Young Tree? She didn't know if she wanted him to be disappointed or not. She put her hands on her little bump. Whoever it was going to be, she failed it. She had thought she was ready. She had thought that if she wasn't ready by now, she never would be. She must have just not been worthy. But what could she have done differently? She continued plodding forwards as the sun grew heavy behind her, so that at least she could die at the feet of a wise old tree. When the sun was going to sleep behind her, she heard something. She stopped moving and listened. She ran to the river, tears streaming from her eyes. She dropped to her hands and knees and drank too quickly, vomited, laughed, and did the exact same thing again and fell asleep at the roots of the wise old tree. Moss woke the next morning to the smell of dogs. She scrambled to her feet, holding her spear in front of her, and heard them scamper away, but she didn't see them. She stood still with heavy breath for many thudding heartbeats. She shouted and brandished her spear to make sure they were gone, and then took a deep breath and looked around her. This had to be the Holy River. What other river was there? She decided she would go back, grab her provisions, then return here and follow the river up to Holy Mountain. Moss found the trail of bent grass she had left while stumbling here the night before and followed it back. Long before Moss's time, in the early days of fire, her people had lived at the foot of Holy Mountain. And there was in that time a young woman, probably a lot like Moss herself, though probably younger. The young woman's blood stopped up in her, so she set out up the Holy Mountain. One of the fathers followed behind. Nobody knows quite why. Perhaps he was curious, perhaps he was afraid. It was in the early days of fire, and perhaps not all people had decided to trust the gods and their gifts. Whatever his reason, he had been a great hunter, so he knew how to follow the keenest of animals in secret, and it is well known that people are not the keenest of animals. So the woman did not know she was followed. Up to the top of the mountain he followed her, but when the gods came down and he saw them, he was afraid, and in his panic and his arrogance he ran at them with his club. And the gods struck him dead on the spot. Since then, Moss's people have migrated in a wide radius around the Holy Mountain, keeping it always at the edge of their horizon, and no one was allowed to get closer except for pregnant women. This is why, though she was so close to the home she had known her whole life, she knew nothing about the area she was in now. Now the sun was not down, but it was sleepy and orange, hovering just over the Holy Mountain when she found her provisions. She smelled them before she saw them. They smelled like a maggoty corpse. She hoped that the smell was not her provisions, but of course she knew better than to seriously entertain such hope. What else would it be? Looking again at the sun, she knew she would not make it back to the river before dark, and she was beginning to think she might as well check to make sure that it was her provisions when she smelled underneath the stench of bad meat the distinct tinge of dog urine. They had found it then, and they would probably be back. Moss bit her thumb and thought. She knew, of course, that she should leave, but could she get far enough away? She started walking away anyways because of the smell of the rotting meat was thick and made it hard to think. She would need a fire tonight. There was no other way. She would not be able to sleep in a tree, so she would need a fire. She had nothing to burn but dead grass, though, and the sticks she used for rubbing fire into them were rolled up in her provisions and probably now slimy with rotten meat. So she found a rock, and piled all the dead grass she could find on top of it, and with the butt of her spear began rubbing fire into the grass. But the spear was big, and it was clumsy work, and it was well into the night before she got her fire going, and at that point it was all she could do to feed it enough grass to keep it burning. She had cleared a wide circle of ripped-up grass around herself and the fire when the rain came and snuffed out the fire altogether. She stood with her spear, listening closely for the sound of dogs approaching. She leaned on her spear, looking around her. She sat on the ground holding her spear, listening for the approach of dogs. She did not think she would fall asleep until she woke to the sound of rustling. She turned, vomited in the ripped-up grass, and stood back up. Looking around herself uncertainly, she thought she had scared them off, but could not be sure. She was alone. Dogs were never alone. She looked across the horizon for the wise old tree, but it was too dark. She was so tired. How could she make it up the holy mountain like this? No provisions, no sleep. She had never realized how terrifying it was, walking alone. Now the smell of her vomit was making her dizzy. She looked up at the stars. She knew that the gods walked among the stars the way people walked on earth. She had heard the stone cloud they rode across the air as it climbed down to Holy Mountain to bless a baby. Her people would hear it if she made it. It sounded like the moan of an aurochs, but longer, more ululating. And they would hear it all the way across the savannah, even when the holy mountain was just a tiny bump on the horizon. She would stand under it. This was her duty as a mother. This was what she had to do, and she knew it. Dogs could not stop her. She could not let dogs stop her. She was a woman now, an adult human being chosen by the gods. And what were dogs? Simpering, cowardly scavengers looking for the dead and the nearly dead. They were nothing. She could not let them scare her. When the sky became gray, she found her wise old tree and made off towards it. She would have to find a place to sleep tonight where she would be safe from the dogs. She could not make it much further, sleeping the way she had been. That was the worst part about walking alone. If she slept on the ground, she would be exactly the easy prey dogs want, and they would surround her before she woke up, and close in on her to a distance that made her spear useless. Even if she was not allowing the dogs to scare her, she still knew never to underestimate them. They're fast and keen and in a pack. When she reached her wise old tree, she could sleep in that, but what about the next night? She hoped they would leave her alone by then, but of course she didn't know. Dogs roam in wide circles, and they might see a person alone as a weak prey. They might have seen her stumbling and thought she was close to death. That she had decided not to be weak prey, and was determined not to be close to death, meant nothing to the dogs. She climbed her tree, having barely the strength to reach the bottom branch, which was just high enough to discourage the dogs at least. In her rabbit pouch she had 4 of the big chewy nuts and nothing else. She ate these and quickly fell asleep. She woke with the sun high and dry vomit on the branch in front of her that she didn't remember making. She looked in her rabbit pouch and then remembered that she had eaten the last of her provisions. Hunger twisted inside her, and she wondered if she should press on anyways. Of course, she could ignore the hunger another day or two. She would be fine, but what about her baby? He was a hungry baby. And if she couldn't even feed him while he was inside of her, what hope did she have of taking care of him when he was born? Of course, she would be with the people by then, and his many fathers would hunt for them, but that was beside the point. Wasn't the idea of this ritual for the mother to prove herself so that the gods could see that she, and so her baby, were worthy of blessing? She resented now more than ever that women aren't allowed to learn hunting. Of course, she could see how swollen with pregnancy or passing blood it would be near impossible to sneak on any animal of any kind. But she is neither now. Or at least, she's only a little swollen. If she could sneak on a deer, if only she knew the way of tracking them, she would gladly right now risk her life for a bit of bloody meat. But she would have to settle on a bit of bloodless meat. At least she had been allowed to learn fishing, though she'd never been good at it. She would just have to learn to be good at it. So she stood where the river was up to her thighs, legs apart, knees bent, spear raised up, trying to peer through the dazzling shimmer of water. The sun beat down on the top of her head and she could see nothing, but at least the water was cool on her feet. She peered harder. She saw them now, as they swam up to sniff at her feet the way fish do if you stand still long enough. She fixed them with a deadly stare and they took no notice. She slowly raised her spear and held her breath. She felt the wood of the spear graze her foot as she plunged it down, which scared her and caused her to fall over. Her head went underwater for just long enough to cause her to jump up in a panic. She clawed her way to shore and looked at her foot for the injury. She had just missed spearing it. Her foot was fine. She was uninjured except for her pride. She waded back out to retrieve her spear from the soft sand at the bottom of the river. She stopped for a while in the middle of the river and waited for the dizzy nausea and cold sweats to pass her by. Of course, all the fish had left, and the sand she'd risen in the commotion made the river murky. She stood there for a while, feeling very foolish, waiting for the sand to settle. When the sun was pressing down on the back of her neck, the glare on the river's surface cleared. She could see them now. They sniffed at her feet and nibbled on the ground. She waited. She watched them. She would have them now. She had decided. They were just stupid things. They wouldn't fool her. They were just worms that lived in the river. They were hers now. As she plunged her spear into the water, she could see them moving out of the way, but she couldn't stop her spear, and it buried itself in the sand. Enraged, she pulled it out and plunged again and again madly into the murky river, knowing but not caring that she was only going to scare more fish away. When all her rage was spent, she stood again in the river, waiting for the sand to settle again, trying not to feel like this was a futile effort. The world had gone orange when the river was clear and she saw the fish again. This was all. If she didn't get it now, she would go hungry. She knew the principle. Raise the spear slowly and plunge it suddenly. Don't give them a chance to be startled. She took a deep breath and raised her spear. Now sloshing back to the riverbanks, tired, sore, frustrated, and hungry, she wondered again if she was good enough to make it to the holy mountain. Maybe the gods had meant her to be barren. Maybe it was a mistake to mate with all the men. Maybe she was never meant to be a mother. What kind of person can't spear a single fish in a day? She climbed her tree dejectedly and sunk slowly into a sullen sleep. She woke up to a thin trickle of vomit over the edge of her branch, then leaned back to go to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come, so she had to settle for a half-conscious sulk. Moss started to fall asleep around dawn, then woke up to the smell of squirrel. Half asleep, she reached out her hand and grabbed something furry. She came fully awake when she realized she had somehow managed to catch a squirrel by the tail. How could such luck even be possible? Laughing at the sudden wave of joy, she dashed its little head against the tree trunk 2 or 3 times until it was dead. She shimmied down the tree, squirrel clutched by the tail in her mouth, stomach rumbling in anticipation. Was this a gift from the gods? It had to be. Maybe she was worthy. She can be a mother and be bad at fishing, can't she? And besides, traveling the riverside would give her plenty of time to practice. She hastily cobbled together a fire from the grass and the dead wood she found at the base of the tree, and skewered the squirrel on a spear and sat down to cook it. Immediately, the squirrel's fur caught fire, and sitting in the smell, she realized only then that she had forgotten to skin it. But even that just made her laugh out loud. She tore into it half-cooked, even ate the thing's little organs. She did not think she would catch any fish that day, but thought that she should try anyways. She did not catch any fish that day. She decided she would stay here and learn how to fish. She would not be able to keep herself alive and walking all the way up the holy mountain if she did not learn to fish. She had a tree here to keep her safe at night, and to give her fire with its dead wood. She had the grass and the bugs and the grubs to keep her baby alive. She did not catch any fish the next day. On the day after that, she did not catch any fish. For several more days, she did not catch fish. She fished and caught nothing, and fed fire and fished and caught nothing, and urinated and defecated at the spot she had chosen downstream, and she fished and caught nothing. She ate grass, and the bugs in the grass, and the bugs in the dead wood, and sometimes she dug up grubs, and all that went to her baby, and she was left empty all the time. She slept by the fire, and when she woke up vomiting, she fed the fire again and went back to sleep. She made a pile of dead wood. She cleared a wide circle around herself and the tree and the fire and the dead wood pile she had made. One day she caught no fish, but she found an enormous snail and made a miniature spear and cooked it. She did not know if snails could have diseases or not. It was a lot to go through for such a small amount of meat, but it was very good. On another day, early in twilight, she lost her temper, stabbing the river over and over again, screaming with rage, but when she pulled out her spear, there was a fish on it. The fish was big enough to fill up both her baby and her belly. She fell asleep that night with the fire she had built to cook it. She threw up fish bones in full darkness under the hidden moon, when the fire was a bed of coals. She heard rustling in the grass. Or was that the river? She listened and didn't hear anything. And then she heard rustling again. Was it the wind? She listened closely. All of her blood jumped as she heard it again. And it was not the wind, that was a paw. She clenched her teeth and stayed absolutely still. For a long time she stayed there, feigning sleep and listening hard. There it was again. Where was it coming from? Were there more than one of them? She clenched her spear closely and rolled to her belly. Bringing her hands and knees underneath her, she jumped to her feet. At times like these, her mind wanted to retreat and leave her body to fend for itself with only instinct, but she forced her mind down into her body, because panic is for animals and people are no good at it. She peered into the shadowy grass. She listened closely. She crept towards the woodpile as though hunting it, looking everywhere around her and listening hard and sniffing the air. Just below the smell of the grass and of the river, there was the smell of something furry. Though she couldn't tell what it was, whatever it or they were. None of them were directly upwind of her, and there was no way of telling how many of them were downwind. In the woodpile there was a branch which had fallen with many of its leaves still on it. Those leaves had dried but not fallen off yet. She reached for it now, and in one swift motion swept it around and stuck it in the coals. There was a short, tense time of blowing on the coals and threatening the darkness with her spear. But when the leaves caught fire, she grabbed the branch and waved it around at the murky pools of darkness in the grass surrounding her, and shouting and snarling. When the fire and the leaves burned out, she listened closely. When she heard nothing, she jumped back to her woodpile and threw 3 sticks on the coals, blowing frantically until they caught. And then 3 more, and then 3 more. And when the fire roared as bright as the day in her little circle, she fell, sweaty and hollowed out, onto her buttocks, holding her spear in both hands. The momentum of her blood made her shake, and she laughed out loud. The fire, of course, burnt out quickly, but she was asleep by then, and whatever it was that she had heard must have run off when it saw the fire. The next day she caught no fish. She was better at fishing when she left her glorious old tree. She was not yet good at it, but if she waited any longer, the boy would grow too big in her belly and she would not be able to reach the holy mountain. Some days she had fish, though most days she had grass and insects in the grass. And sometimes she dug for grubs, and occasionally she found a bush or a tree with berries or nuts. And she would fill her rabbit-skin pouch with them and either sleep under the bush or continue up the river. Every time the sun got heavy, she cleared an area of grass around her and burned it all. And some nights she didn't have any wood to burn, so she stayed up all night, feeding more and more grass into the fire. And some nights, even when she did have wood to burn, she didn't sleep and just fed the fire. And sometimes she woke to the fire guttering out and either rekindled it from the embers, brandishing her spear at the darkness, or brandished her spear at the darkness all night, after finding not enough embers to start up the fire again. And some nights she heard the gentle padding of paws in the grass, and some nights she smelled a dog who had not managed to stay completely downwind, and some nights she slept all the way through, awakening in daylight terrified, because now she feared constantly that she would awaken to find herself being attacked by dogs. And in her dreams she was pulled apart and divvied among the dogs. And the alpha with its mouth pulled out from her vagina a beautiful baby boy with intelligent eyes, and crushed his head in its jaws. But sometimes also in her dreams she sat atop Holy Mountain with the gods, striking fish with lightning bolts and laughing and laughing. And eventually, waking in the morning, she caught fish almost as often as not. And more she found herself waking up before her fires guttered out and feeding them and going back to sleep. And the holy mountain grew closer, but sometimes she thought she still heard dogs. The moon went through 2 cycles before she reached the forest of shaggy trees with stiff hair-like leaves just before the holy mountain. She had respite from the dogs, as the shaggy trees gave her more deadwood than she could use, and their scaly fruits made for quick kindling, so her fires burnt brightly all night. Perhaps the trees had more fish in their shade, or they were easier to see, or she was getting better at fishing. But she was eating fish every night, and sometimes ventured a mushroom when she was feeling brave. And one time she killed a chipmunk, though her flint knife had gone very dull, so she couldn't skin it, and she cooked its fur like she had with the squirrel. And like with the squirrel, the smell of burning fur hung over her all the while she was eating. Though this time she hadn't been quite so hungry as she had with the squirrel, so the smell did ruin it, though she ate it dutifully, including the organs. Her belly was starting to stretch now, and her ankles were hurting. She could still move just fine, but she had to move quickly. It would only get harder to move as the baby grew heavier. She spent less time fishing. Fishing also hurt her back. She turned over rocks and ate all the bugs, and sometimes dug for grubs and worms. She always kept scanning the tops of trees and found a fair amount of nests that weren't too hard to reach and ate their eggs. One time she tried to cook an egg by putting it in the fire. It didn't work. The shell cracked and all the food spilled out and turned to ember before she could get to it. Her respite in this place was short. The half-hidden moon had just come up to share the sky with the sun when she came to an abrupt end of the forest. The forest ended in a straight line. Moss had never seen a straight line of trees before. She stopped in her tracks. You cannot imagine what this would have been like. There was a ring around the mountain. Of course, she couldn't see the whole thing, but it did go all the way around the mountain. It was approximately 2 miles thick, and within it everything had been utterly destroyed. The soil was rich and lush, but somehow grew nothing but rocks. And beyond it was the Holy Mountain. The Holy Mountain was not a large mountain or a steep one. Even as swollen with pregnancy as she was, she thought she would be able to climb it over the course of no more than 2 days. Nothing grew on it except some tufts of that short type of grass that grows in rocky areas and always looks dead until it goes to seed. Some thirsty-looking, wide-tangled bushes, and towering proudly and persistently over all of the squalor, just above the roots of the mountain was an enormous and powerful tree. On the top half of that mountain nothing grew at all, nor was there any soil. Her rabbit-skin pouch was half full of the tiny nuts the shaggy trees produce and half full of their scaly fruits, and thrust into it were 2 sticks for fire. She took a deep breath and proceeded towards the Holy Mountain. Even before her feet touched the soil, her heart began racing. She had long believed the ring was made around the Holy Mountain to inspire people with the terror the mysterious ways of the gods deserve and demand. She felt that terror now. The soil was so fertile. She felt if she had just happened to drop one of these nuts, it would immediately take seed and grow before her very eyes. But there was nothing, not a sapling, not even one blade of grass. She had never seen anything so barren, so orderly. The gods carved the land as easily as she would carve wood. They made it do their bidding. This was the first time she seriously considered turning back. Who was she to ask anything of beings like this? Most women her age had 3 or 4 children. Who was she to bother them with the only one she had managed to produce? She, who had waited 3 cycles of the moon until her belly began to swell because she didn't know, even then, if she would carry this baby all the way? Well, she was a woman. That was who. Any woman is a person. And people are chosen by the gods. What more was there? The gods demanded respect and terror, and that was true. But they required reason above all. She would overcome that terror. She owed it to her baby for having conceived him. She fixed her eyes on a big and powerful tree on the other side of the lifeless ring, growing noble and imperious over all the scrub and grasses. Then the wind changed direction and she smelled them. The dogs were close when she turned around, maybe 30 paces. When she began to run, they began to run. The soil was soft and she struggled for traction. She was halfway through her pregnancy and her legs had been growing stronger by the day, but her joints had been growing weaker. As soon as she began running, she was gasping for breath. She expected at any moment for her calves to be grabbed by teeth. She believed she was going to die. Short, sharp grass scratched at her feet, and her body started going uphill. She had reached the holy mountain, but only to be torn apart by dogs at its roots. She didn't know whether that was better or worse. But they were quadrupedal. They were built for running. Her legs and buttocks were smeared with watery feces. She was so sure that she was about to die that when she reached the powerful old tree, she screamed in surprise and terror, and for what felt like a long time stood there, confused, before climbing to the lowest branch. She stayed on that branch for a long time, wheezing and panting and coughing so badly that she didn't know if she was going to live or die, and all the while the dogs were snapping at her feet. She pawed at the tears in her eyes and on her cheeks and climbed to the second branch, still breathing hard. The dogs stopped snapping and started pacing and growling. And then they stopped, and then they sat and looked up at her. And they waited. It began to grow dark. They couldn't reach her, but they also wouldn't leave. She would have to wait them out. She laid down to sleep. She laid on her back and stared up at the slowly ruffling leaves, and the hints of stars and the moon dazzling between them. But her heart was still racing, and she was still breathing hard, and fear still prickled at her skin, and she could smell them. She climbed further up, though she knew the dogs couldn't reach her where she was. She found a crook between several large branches where she could curl up, and after a while she was able to catch her breath, and the prickles of fear in her skin softened to leaden sleep. She woke to the smell of rabbit blood. Hunger twisted inside her, and her mouth filled it with saliva. She began to climb down and saw them. The smell of dogs suddenly overwhelmed her. They paced around the tree. They jogged off in pairs to hunt rabbits, but stayed nearby. The biggest one was sitting patiently, watching her with expectant eyes. 2 other dogs brought offerings of rabbit and placed them in front of it. It did not look away from Moss. She looked in its eyes. It was the alpha. She thought she knew what she had to do. Try to do. She looked for her spear and saw that it was on the ground, right next to the bottom branch. She looked back at the alpha. It was known that if you can kill or scare off the alpha, the courage would go right out of the dog pack, and they would scuttle away with their tails between their legs. She began climbing down, and all of the dogs stopped and looked at her. She stopped. They paced slowly back and forth underneath her, tilting their heads and lifting their ears to listen to her breathing. She clenched her jaws shut and blinked back tears, breathing sharply through her nose. She held her mind down. She would get her spear back. She was smarter than the dogs. Be smarter than the dogs. She took a deep breath and looked around for a dead branch in the powerful old tree. She would not have found her branch had she not stubbornly climbed trees all her life in spite of her mother's disapproval. She would not have moved easily enough in the tree, pregnant as she was. As it was, she was breathing hard when she found it. And after she broke it off, she had to sit down with her head in her hands and try to catch her breath as she waited out the cold sweats and nausea. She had never thrown a spear before. She had never learned how. There was never any reason to learn how, since women weren't allowed to hunt. She worked her way to her feet and slowly, methodically climbed down the tree, keeping her eyes on dogs as they came to the tree, to the bottom branch, pacing underneath. Some were standing on their hind legs to get a better view of her. Some were wagging their tails. The alpha stayed where it was, 2 dead rabbits untouched in front of him, staring up at her. By the time she reached the second to last branch, they were wriggling under the base of the tree, snapping preemptively at the bottom branch and barking. The alpha was sitting there, staring imperiously up at her. She took a long, deep breath and forced herself to exhale. She did this several times and then jumped down to the bottom branch. As her foot slipped and her body fell to the ground, she flailed her club in a wide arc. There was a muffled thud of flesh just before she hit the ground. She scrambled to her feet, still waving the club violently. The dogs stayed around her, barking and wagging their tails, just outside her reach. Some were bouncing on their forepaws. The alpha began to pant. She glanced at the ground and didn't see her spear. She looked back towards the tree, and looked each dog in the eyes to hide her fear, still waving her club. Was that blood on the ground from her? She stepped on something and jumped. It was her spear. She threw her club. One dog flinched as the club hit its face, but all the others rushed in without hesitation. She made it all the way up to the crook she had slept in before she realized how much her leg was bleeding. At the time, she was so amazed to still be alive that she didn't care very much. When she was able to level out her breathing and clear the tears away from her eyes, she climbed out to the branch facing the alpha, and gingerly, experimentally, worked her way up to her feet. There was a trail of blood leading up the tree to her. She couldn't put much weight on that foot. The alpha stared at her expectantly, 2 dead rabbits at its feet, still untouched. She gritted her teeth and growled at it, and had to force herself to stop growling, had to force herself to breathe in deep, even breaths as she raised her spear. She practiced in her mind. Take a deep breath. Look at where you need the spear to go. Exhale and send it. Exhale and send the spear where it needs to go. She practiced in her mind for a long time. The alpha flinched as the spear came towards it, and sniffed it curiously after it bounced sideways off the top of its head. The alpha looked back up at Moss. She thought she would scream. She thought she would scream and cry and maybe defecate on herself again, and maybe throw herself headfirst from the tree so she wouldn't have to starve. And hopefully she would crush her head so that she wouldn't have to be alive when the dogs ripped her apart. Instead, she lowered herself and straddled the branch she had been sitting on, because her injured leg was not going to hold her up for much longer. She looked through her rabbit skin pouch for nuts because she was hungry. She wasn't quite sure what her plan was when she took out the scaly fruit and the smooth stick she had brought to make fire. Only that she was human, and humans were chosen by the gods to be smart. And she had decided, hadn't she, that she would be smarter than the dogs. She would not be beaten by a pack of scavengers. As she rubbed fire into the scaly fruit, she stared at the alpha, stared deeply into its eyes, so that it would know that she was not afraid. She would never be sure, but for a moment, just before the scaly fruit ignited, she thought she saw fear. With her smooth stick, she batted the burning scaly fruit at the alpha. She never had, nor would she ever again, see anything move quite so fast as the dogs ran away then. The fire leapt up to devour the tuft of tangled grass that grew behind the alpha and ran greedily among the dry, dead new growth of the shorter grass. It devoured in single gulps the angry-looking bushes. Unopposed, it devoured the mountain. It ate all the dogs and mice and insects and birds that could not outrun it, as the ones that did escaped scurried and panicked across the wide border of empty soil. From where they were, Moss's people could see Holy Mountain burn, and many of them mourned her death. Many of Moss's siblings mourned, and many of the fathers of Moss's baby mourned, because they all believed her to be dead. But Moss's mother did not mourn. And young old Tree held on to some hope because Moss's mother did not believe her to be dead. And of course, though mothers always took the longest to accept the deaths of their own children, young old Tree had always thought that if a person's mother believed them to be alive, then that person was not certainly dead. Though of course he believed that Moss was probably dead. He wondered why Moss's mother held off mourning. The fire raged and screamed and tore at the thick old tree, in whose protective crook Moss had curled up into a ball. The tree was feverish to the touch, There was one spot in the crook of the tree where she could hold her face and breathe. If she moved her face at all, she would immediately begin coughing and would not stop for a long time. She coughed up a lot of sooty mucus, which had nowhere to go but onto the bark directly in front of her. Sweat poured down into her eyes and smoke rose up into them, and she could not cry enough to keep her eyes clean, and she squeezed them shut as hard as she could. She found herself unable to breathe sometimes, and other times she couldn't stop screaming. The bark tore at the scabs in her legs, and the freshly flowing blood clotted over the tree to which she held her leg, forming a shared scab between her and the tree. She faded in and out of consciousness. She coughed up sooty chunks that may have had blood in them. But though the fire consumed and expended all the weak, dry plants in its undergrowth, it could do nothing to the powerful old tree. And though she had inhaled enough smoke to be coughing for many seasons to come, it had not been enough for her to suffocate. And though all the hair on her body was singed and her skin was scalded, she was not badly burned. When the fire receded, she waited another day for the embers to burn down, and she mostly slept. The ground was still hot when she climbed down, but not hot enough to burn her feet. All of Holy Mountain was covered in ash, and nothing on it still lived. The rabbits the Alpha had left behind were badly burned, but still edible. They tasted like smoke and were hard to chew. She never enjoyed any food more before or after, even when she had been facing starvation. She washed herself in the cold, ashy river for a long time before limping the rest of the way up Holy Mountain. It took her 3 days, during which she neither ate nor slept nor stopped for any reason than to pass waste or to drink from the river. With the gods. The beginning of the river was just below the top of the mountain. It flowed from something that was like a tree stump, except that it was made from something that was like stone, although it was not stone. More of this substance that was like stone and was not stone grew out of the steep part of the mountain. It looped like roots out of the cliffside, but evenly spaced. They were cold to the touch, and she climbed up on them. The very ground on the top of Holy Mountain was like nothing she had ever seen before. It was soft and warm and dark, and had almost the consistency of a mushroom, but harder. It lay completely smooth across the plateau, but it was solid and did not come off on her feet. And all across it were lines and angles that reminded her of the marks men make in dirt and on cave walls when teaching boys to hunt in the spring. Except that the marks on the Holy Mountain were different colors and had no apparent meaning. On one side in the center stood an enormous stalagmite, with smooth sides and sharp corners, as though the land itself had been carved into a tool of some kind. It was made of the stuff that was like stone but was not stone. Having felt the first cold wind of the season, Moss's people began migrating towards the God's Lake. All had given up Moss for dead except for her mother, and even she didn't have much hope that she would not be mourning soon. Moss would not be the first young mother to die on pilgrimage, nor the first child her mother had lost. It was always melancholy when a woman died on pilgrimage. Even those who didn't mourn would wake up the next day thinking of the woman the people had lost and the baby they never got. And whether they knew her or not, the world was just that much less cheerful. Her mother screamed when they heard the bellowing of the stone cloud. She jumped up and down, and she slapped the backs and arms of everyone who was standing near her and pointed at Holy Mountain, and everyone watched in disbelief as the stone cloud lowered itself to the summit. From where they were, it looked like a flat, smooth stone from an impossibly huge river. From where Moss was, it was incredibly bright and cold, like a sun made of ice instead of fire. Beings that were like men but were not men came out of that light. And though she was certain at that moment that they were going to kill her, she felt no temptation to run or to fight them. The thought simply never occurred to her. She just stood there. One of them gestured towards her and her knees buckled, and she fell back onto a cloud, and suddenly her arms and her legs were too heavy to lift. They were impossibly tall. Their heads were too big for their necks. But the light was too bright for her to see anything else. They brought her to the strange stalagmite. It was so tall. It was impossibly tall. Then she lay paralyzed on her cloud at its base, and she could not see the top of it. She could not see how, but one of the gods reached into the towering stalagmite, and though he just touched it, made a hole in it big enough for them all to go through. And in doing so revealed a cave inside of it, just large enough for the two of them and her. The wall sealed itself shut behind them, and it took her eyes a long time to adjust to the lighting. She was completely enclosed with the man-like things, and paralyzed and nearly blind. She was more helpless than she had ever been, more helpless than she had ever seen anyone survive being. Through spots in her adjusting vision, she saw them moving gracefully around in the cave. They pricked her with strange thorns in her wounded leg and in her left inner elbow. She was neither able to draw back from the pain, nor do anything but watch as they collected her blood and things that looked like sacks made of water. They looked closely over all her sweaty, scalded body, with enormous eyes that were totally black, like the eyes of a rat. They scrutinized the bite in her leg, which they picked and prodded with many strange sticks and thorns, and then held to it a torch with a strange kind of fire that didn't burn with pain but with a sharp tingling. They took away her rabbit pouch, and she could do nothing but cry. She could not even scream. She began hyperventilating as they pierced her belly with two long, smooth, sharp sticks, much the same way one catches termites by sticking a long stick into their nest. She was trying again to scream when she saw suddenly over her left shoulder an image appear of what looked like a human baby, but had an enormous head and beady eyes like theirs, and its skin reminded her of the intestines of larger animals. It appeared on only one section of the wall, but behind it she could see what looked like a chamber made of flesh. Was this one of their offspring? Were their offspring kept in separate chambers like bees? Did these man-like creatures control the lights? In the image on the wall she saw what looked like a snake with a sharpened head, slithering around the fleshy chamber. She looked back at the man-like creatures, and they too were transfixed by the image, though their hands remained busy with the strange sticks they had pierced her with. And she looked back at the image, and the snake was approaching the baby's head. The baby kicked, and her baby kicked, and with a sudden impossible realization, terror surged through her body, and finding it useless, ran up through her throat, causing her to vomit and pass out. When she woke up, she was at the foot of the monolith, next to a pile of cooked meat and strange yellow fruit and delicious leaves that she had never seen before. Her rabbit skin was back around her, and it was filled with enormous nuts, whose strange shapes showed that they could not have been grown but must have been made by the gods. She laughed weeping, or wept laughing. Alone again. Being swollen with pregnancy, she moved very slowly. As she reached the bottom of the holy mountain, she found it still completely barren except for the powerful old tree. The forest of shaggy trees was completely untouched by fire. She understood now the reason for the ring of dead soil. She understood now the terror and the goodness of the gods. She followed the river from Holy Mountain, knowing that by the time she reached the lake the autumn would have come, and her people would be there. She fished every night, and some nights she had fish, and other nights she had grass and bugs, and every night she had fire. And she never saw another animal on the land, neither predator nor prey. With Acorn, she gave birth under the wise old tree, squatting and screaming and then falling next to a fire she had built out of habit to scare off predators she had begun to doubt even existed anymore. And she came back to the people nursing her daughter with both hands. Her daughter grew up and they called her Acorn. And shortly after the time Acorn began passing blood, she terrified people by trying to lure a dog to the fire with a piece of venison. So terrified were all the people that they moved to attack Acorn. And Moss was able to defend Acorn with her spear, but probably would not have been if Acorn hadn't had so many fathers. Her people killed one dog, then ran the rest off. After that was winter, and when the winter began melting, Acorn had stopped passing blood. A baby of 3 fathers was forming inside her, so she left for the Holy Mountain. Unlike her mother, she left at proper times, though when she came back, the baby was still inside her and was just starting to show. When she came back, everyone marveled to see that she had 2 dogs with her, who walked beside her as though she was a dog too. And when people nervously approached them, they growled. But Acorn shouted at the dogs, and the dogs cowered but did not run. When men went to hunt deer and goat and aurochs, she went to hunt rabbits and squirrels, and always brought some meat, and sometimes more than she could carry, whereas the men brought much meat but only occasionally. And the dogs had puppies, and many of the puppies stayed and lived among the people, as though they thought they were people, or as though they thought the people were dogs. And it was known for many generations after that Moss had only had 1 baby, and that on the way up the mountain she had been stalked by dogs, and that she had asked the gods to teach her baby to kill the dogs and all the other predators that had plagued her people. But the gods, being wise beyond the imagination of humans, had already devised a different solution, so they taught her baby how to talk to dogs and teach them to be good. And when her baby grew inside her, Acorn stopped hunting for 2.5 cycles of the moon, since she could no longer walk quietly. And she gave birth to her first son, and she made a sling for carrying him and tied it with a strip of rawhide around her. Moss could never make anything from rawhide, but Acorn had grown up with it and was good with it. Acorn often laughed at her mother's incomprehension, but was just as mystified when one of her own daughters, who by her people was called Summer Rain, tried to teach her how to tie down a young sapling so that it would spring up and suddenly catch a rabbit all on its own. She eventually learned to do it, but never understood how Summer Rain knew the rabbit would come under the sapling, or that the sapling would snatch up the rabbit when it did so. Things went on like this for an incomprehensibly long time, and of course most of it was forgotten later on.